In the early 1950s, a young Air Force psychiatrist named Robert J. Lifton found himself stationed in Japan and South Korea during the Korean War. Unlike many of his peers who saw psychiatry as a tool for military efficiency, Lifton was fascinated by the minds behind the uniforms, the soldiers' fears, moral injuries, and stories. Around this time, American officials began panicking over reports that U.S. prisoners of war had been brainwashed by Chinese captors. Government agencies hurried to understand how disciplined soldiers could reject their country's propaganda and, in some cases, express sympathy for communist ideology. Lifton, curious and unafraid, was selected to interview returning POWs. On the troopship General John Pope, as it carried men across the Pacific back to America, he spent hours listening to their stories. These were not simple debriefings. The atmosphere was strange, grateful yet anxious. The soldiers spoke of interrogation rooms, endless repetition, and a subtle psychological erosion. When Lifton asked one GI how he had resisted, the man smiled faintly. "We just put our minds in neutral." That phrase became the seed of a lifelong inquiry. Lifton began to piece together what the communist Chinese had called Si Xiang Gai Zhao, thought reform. It wasn't torture in the traditional sense. It was a systematic reshaping of belief through environmental control, confession rituals, and emotional exhaustion. Determined to understand it firsthand, Lifton traveled to Hong Kong in the late 1950s to interview Chinese intellectuals and Christian missionaries who had escaped the People's Republic of China after enduring forced re-education programs. Over hundreds of meticulous interviews, he recognized a chilling pattern: isolation from external information, confession of ideological sins, manipulation through guilt and purity, and the insistence that the party's truth was absolute. These were not just techniques of persuasion, they were tools to dismantle identity itself. By the time Lifton returned to the United States, he had identified recurring mechanisms used in these environments, psychological levers that controlled behavior, information, and emotion. When he published Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism in 1961, he outlined what he called the 8 criteria of thought reform. Each reflected a deeper observation born of lived testimony. Milieu control, drawn from accounts of Chinese universities where even friendships were monitored and letters censored. Mystical manipulation, inspired by how leaders staged spiritual revelations to maintain loyalty. Demand for purity, derived from survivors who described their lives as an endless confession. Confession, because in every re-education setting, self-criticism sessions enforced guilt-based compliance. Sacred science, seen in the absolute veneration of Mao's ideology, which could not be rationally questioned. Loading the language, the creation of ideological jargon that narrowed thought itself. Doctrine over person, where lived experience was reinterpreted to fit party lines. Dispensing of existence, perhaps the most haunting, where dissenters were rendered non-persons. Lifton saw these not as relics of the Cold War, but as a universal psychology of totalism, anywhere an ideology demands total surrender of the self. After his studies in China, Lifton's curiosity turned to other extreme environments. In Hiroshima, 1962, he lived among atomic bomb survivors and documented what he called the death imprint, showing how mass trauma could change not only the psyche, but humanity's very sense of meaning. His empathy bridged scholarship and humanity. He later analyzed the minds of Vietnam War veterans, Nazi doctors, and apocalyptic cult leaders, seeing in each case new forms of what he first found on that crowded troopship: humans navigating moral annihilation and forced conformity. For Lifton, the 8 criteria were more than an academic framework. They were a warning that systems of control could arise anywhere when humans stopped questioning their realities. As he later reflected, what frightened him most was not cruelty, but the banality of control, how ordinary people in search of belonging could surrender to totalism without realizing it. Robert Lifton spent his century-long life reminding the world that true freedom begins in the mind, in the courage to see clearly when someone else dictates your reality.